Citizens of the world, friends and family, welcome back to another Keep Yours podcast, and welcome to the first in our series of the history of the U.S. financial system. Now, if we're going to talk about finance in America today, with all of the chaos going on in markets, interest rate manipulation, central banks, all of these things that we deal with currently, the only way we're really going to understand them and also answer the question of what is the role of government and should it be limited in not just a financial sense, but also in a political sense. To get to answers to these questions, first, we need to study history. And we need to get to know why things were done in the past. And I've spent a lot of the last year looking back and thinking about how the founding fathers set up the United States. And more importantly, why? Because it's the why that leads us to the answers of how do we fix our current predicaments. Because most of our current predicaments exist because we didn't follow the rules that they set up for us. And there's many reasons why. It's often said that the road to hell is paved in good intentions. And I think for the most part, if we look at the U.S. financial history, that's largely the case. That some of it was done with knowing intent, but much of it was done with good intentions. But obviously those intentions have not panned out. We stand on the precipice of the fourth turning, where we are going to have some major changes because we've got unsustainable debt loads at every single level. The federal deficits, the state deficits, the student loan crises, the amount of debt that Americans hold in all sorts of credit is all at all-time highs, whether it's car debt or whether it's home loan debt. We've got state pensions and Social Security that's completely underfunded. And we have a government who wants to start sending out everybody checks all the time. So when we say, well, if we're going to fix it, what are we going to do? First, we need to study some history. So Mr. James Humes, a former U.S. presidential speechwriter, happened to be one of my professors. And he used to do a lot of Winston Churchill impressions, and they were pretty good. But he met Winston Churchill when he was very young. And Churchill told him, study history. In history lies all the secrets of statescraft. Now, James Humes was a speechwriter for multiple presidents in the United States. And he's a great storyteller, and his books are fantastic. I highly recommend them. I have several. And having him as a professor or an adjunct professor was amazing, considering the small school that I went to. So I agree with Churchill. It's study history. And not for the secrets of statescraft, but for the understanding of why our country was founded the way that it is. You know, we often like to say in America that we have a democracy, but we don't really have a democracy. We have a representative republic. And because in a real democracy, every single issue would be brought before the people and we would have a vote on it every time. And the majority would rule on every issue. But that's not what we have. We have a representative democracy where we send our representatives via our democratic vote to state legislatures and national legislatures, where they then represent us in a republic, where not every person's vote counts the same. For example, in the United States Senate, there are 2 senators from every state. So if you live in California, you have 2 senators for 50 million people. And if you live in Wyoming, you have 2 senators for 2 million people, give or take. So how far back in history do we want to go? I don't know. According to nature, humans have been around for a little while, like 3 to 4 million years. When they find a 3.8 million year old skull, it makes us all kind of rethink all the things we've been told. Because when I grew up, no one was telling me that humans had been on the planet for 3 to 4 million years. I was told of hunter-gatherers for a small time, and then 10,000 years ago, all of a sudden, we found that we could grow crops, and everything's progressed in a linear fashion since then. But what if things don't progress in a linear fashion? What if we've had great things happen in civilization before that have gone away? But we stand at this precipice today of a country divided. Almost split, divided in terms of who we wanted to lead right now, with two of the oldest people to ever run, and we now have the oldest president ever. But 70 million people voted for Donald Trump. That's more people than have ever voted for a president who lost in history. So it's reasonable that he didn't necessarily believe that you could get 70 million votes and lose. How is that possible? Which actually goes to show that right now we've got a lot of people engaged in the political process in America, which again, if you study history, if we look at what the founding fathers required of citizens, and maybe why only landowners were given the original right to vote, we might find out that inside of that are reasons because of the information you need. Now, that's not to say that I don't believe everyone should get a vote. However, I do believe that just like getting a driver's license, there should be a minimum amount that you need to know before you go vote. So the fundamental question that we need to ask is, what is the job of government? What job do we want government to do? Is it supposed to make sure that you have a job? Is it supposed to make sure you have an education? Is it supposed to make sure you have retirement? Is it supposed to make sure you have health care? Is it supposed to wash your clothes for you? Is it supposed to feed you? At what point do we say that a government cannot do all of these things because it's too much? And when we look at what is the job of government, we need to look at how the government is done at executing its current requirement tasks, many of which it's given itself. Right? I would say that as far as they've done with jobs, education, retirement, healthcare, all of those things seem to have major problems attached to them. We've got 900,000 people a week filing for unemployment. So if the government just create jobs, well, it would do it. So we have to figure out the things that governments can and can't even do. So even if we wanted the government to make sure we have a job, is that a job, or is that just the government could ensure we have something to do? And maybe we could actually make that happen, but it wouldn't be the jobs that actually support and grow the economy, but maybe we could guarantee that we will pay people to do things that need to be done, such as pick up trash in the streets, or clean government buildings, or all sorts of other things that need to be done in the world that people may not necessarily want to do. Now, should that be the role of government? I don't believe so, but that's just me. What about the government's role in education? And we could talk about that on several different levels. On a local level, I would say 100%. On a state level, some. On a federal level, why is the federal government dictating what's taught in Austin, Texas, or San Bernardino, California? What do they know about the people who live there? What do they know about their issues? How's the government done with our retirement plan, Social Security? Seeing how we know that it's unfunded, we hear about it all the time. And it's expected to be broke before I'm supposed to get any of it. Same with Medicare. How are we doing with healthcare in general? We spend more money on healthcare in America than any other country, and we have some of the worst outcomes. How does that make any sense? Obviously, we're not doing a good job there. So we give the government all of these things to do, but how do we hold it accountable? How do we prevent it from continuing to grow in size? Because while Republicans used to say that they were for small government, No Republican shrunk the government that I can remember. And in fact, we haven't had a balanced budget since the Clinton administration. And let's not pretend that the Clinton administration magically balanced the budget. The Clintons came into power while there were massive increases in productivity due to computers. Because you put one word program on a computer, and all of a sudden one secretary can send out 100 letters in a day, versus before you needed 10 secretaries to type up all of those letters. So computers ushered in a huge boom of productivity. And that grew the economy, and that gave us a balanced budget, because finally the government was collecting more than it was spending. But they don't like to do that for too long. So since then, they've been spending money like crazy. And getting us in debt like crazy. When do we pull out of that debt? When are we going to pay that back? Because we have debt like we had after World War II, but no war. Well, we have wars, none of which should have been fought. So we have to look at the government's role in that. How the government gets us into all of these wars, and what should be the response to that. Should citizens have the right to vote in and out of wars? Should Congress have to declare war for every military action around the country, around the world? I don't necessarily know the answers to all these questions, but they need to be raised. Now, when the founding fathers set up America, why did Benjamin Franklin say, "We give you a republic if you can keep it"? He wasn't being facetious. He meant that statement. And clearly that's meant to tell us that the republic that we have is fragile. We think that what goes on in other countries, where we see totalitarians take over countries like Chavez has done in Venezuela, where we see someone like Putin in Russia or even Xi in China that have total control over that entire country. And we say to ourselves, that couldn't happen here. Why not? It certainly could. As the powers of government have increased exponentially, so does the threat that we devolve into a country that is run by a few people. And in fact, some would say we're already there. What's government's role for money? And why? And how? And how are we the people supposed to hold the government accountable? If I look at the rise of Bitcoin, those that are deeply involved with Bitcoin would say that's the people's money, because the governments can't control it, because those ledgers are kept on tens of thousands of computers and therefore decentralized and not controllable by one government entity. They can't just instantly create more Bitcoin like they created millions and billions and trillions of currency last year. So to figure out the answer to this future question, a history of the U.S. financial system leads us to an educated discussion about what is the role of government and why. Without the why, it really doesn't do us any good. But the what is, what are we going to do going forward, right? We need to understand what happened in the United States with all the good and the bad. Everyone wants to focus on the freedom and prosperity with the story we've been told to manifest destiny, while we don't want to acknowledge the genocide of the native people who were living in the Americas, who one guy looking for India decided to call Indians, and we've called them that ever since. We should probably stop that. I'm not sure what the name should be, whether it's First Nations, people that is used in Canada, or if it's just Americans or Native Americans. And I would say that we shouldn't decide what that name should be, but we need to acknowledge that whether it was the Spanish conquistadors in Central America, whether it was Portuguese in Brazil, whether it was the British in America, whether it was the French in Canada, the takeover of America is not one of manifest destiny, because a lot of people died to get this country to where it was. Now, there's reasons that people left. There's reasons people were fleeing on boats as indentured servants to work 7 years just to pay for their passage, because that's how bad it had gotten in Europe. Why? What were those governments like that they were fleeing? Why eventually did the colonies of the United States decide they'd had enough and got themselves their own independence? Why were they willing to fight for that? How did that come about? These are the things we need to understand. Now, if we look at what the Founding Fathers set up in America and the creation of the United States, here's the way that I picture this. The revolution is fought, and I'm willing to imagine that a good chunk of Americans did not believe America would win that war. Didn't believe we had the resources to do that. And we know plenty of Americans stood with Britain because they benefited from the British system. So if we look at all of a sudden, the smartest people in our country get a chance to set up a brand new country, and they get to look back at history of all of the different systems that have been recorded at that time, and all the different types of government that had been in place, and all the pitfalls that those governments had run into, and try and create a republic that was of the people, by the people, and for the people. That's an amazing opportunity. And I think we're going to get ourselves into the situation very shortly where we have a similar opportunity to revamp the way that government is run in America, to decide if we believe that super PACs should be allowed, that corporations should have the ability to put as much money into political campaigns as they want as a means of free speech, to determine the size that companies can even be, to reset the role of government in America. We get to do that again very soon, because what we have right now is completely broken. And in the future, in the near future, we're going to have to answer these questions. So how far back in history do we go? Because, as we just saw, humans have been on the planet for 3 to 4 million years. All right. That's not what they told us in the history books when I was growing up. And they also told us that most of the monuments that we see around the world are fairly recent, like the pyramids in Egypt. However, based on astrology, in which the astrological system resets itself every 26,000 years, the pyramids in Giza are perfectly aligned with Orion about 11,500 years ago. Also, those were massive stones. And while conventional wisdom in Egypt says those were tombs, there's never been a body found inside that's been, wrapped up like the mummies were. All of those were elsewhere. So the pyramids of Giza, astrologically perfect, probably built some other reason, some other way. Obviously, humans understood the symbology with the stars and their interconnectedness. What about Machu Picchu? Why did the people of Peru haul all of this rock to the top of a mountain to create what looks like a grand city in the sky, where you might not even be able to grow food? They built these crazy huge walls with perfect intricate linings where the rocks connect. Look at this work that they did with rock. Not only are these structures still standing, of sizes of massive rock that we probably couldn't move today, But they also, amazingly, are very adept at surviving earthquakes. So much so, in fact, that if you go to Cuzco, where the Sun Temple used to be, that the Christians tore down and built a Catholic church on top of, that Catholic church has now been knocked down by earthquakes. But the foundation that they used is still there. That's amazing. Structures around the world that were built a lot longer ago than anyone wants to tell us. Many of them are now underwater. So while the discussion of global warming is ongoing, the truth is the world's been warming for the last 14,000 years. And in so, sea levels have risen 400 feet. Now, across the world, everyone has stories of Atlantis. And underneath the water, it shows that these places existed. In India, this has now been found 130 feet underwater. Oh yeah, and just by the way, Sanskrit, oldest written language we know of, and we don't know how old it really is. But many of the things from antiquity are not even available to us because they are underwater. And it's not just there. The story of Atlantis goes around the world. There are pyramids in Japan that are underwater, unexplainably, in places where there weren't necessarily habitations. Sunken ruins of Port Royal in Jamaica. But I thought that Columbus in 1492 would have been the first boat that showed up. So why would you need a port in a place that doesn't have boats? Maybe our history books are a little, well, I'd say outdated, except for they haven't dated them. The most fascinating one is Gobeki Tepi in Turkey. Now, this place was buried intentionally, filled in with rock, because they probably knew it was going to happen. They probably knew, astrologically, or somebody came and told them from potentially another planet that bad things were about to happen on Earth, and they should cover up their ruins. The Clovis culture in the Americas had amazing tools, and they were hunting mastodons. And we know this because we found samples that are very, very old in San Diego, and more have been dug up now in Florida, of mastodon bones being broken apart by humans. Now, at the same time that the Clovis people disappear, the mastodons disappear. The saber-toothed tigers in America disappear. The American horse disappears. All of the large mammals disappear in America and are not brought back to the Americas for thousands of years. So what happened? We don't know. There's the Younger Dryas theory that says, similar to how the dinosaurs became extinct, that asteroids hit the planet and it wiped out all of the big beasts again, and many of the humans living at that time. So if we have skulls that are 4 to 5 million years old, but people wiped off the planet 13,000 years ago, what was America before? How long were people here? We were told when I was growing up that people walked over a land bridge 10,000 years ago. Now we know that's nonsense because the Clovis people that were here 13,000 years ago. But these studies say that people were here a lot longer. And why wouldn't have they been? Probably were. The amazing thing is we've got monuments around the world that we cannot explain, left to us by people who obviously wanted to show us what we're capable of in terms of creating things. From Easter Island to Angkor Wat, to Stonehenge, places around the world that we'll say make our imaginations run wild. But obviously, there were reasons and cultures that supported these. And the astrological alignment makes it seem like all the more educated these people used to be. So our history and what we're told is very, very recent. And so when I say we're going to study some history, we're not going to go back that far. We're going to go back to the last 12,000 years under the quote-unquote civilized. Now here's the reason that I bring this up. Because at the end of the day, keep yours. I started because I felt like people needed a financial education. Now, here's the part about that doesn't make any sense to me. If we humans were living up to our highest level of expectation, our highest possible vibration, we're all being our best selves, we would have no need for money. Money, as it exists now, is a human construct. Humans decided that certain things are worth something, or money will be a medium of exchange, and we will use things, such as gold and silver, which has been used for the last 5,000 years plus. All right? But these civilizations seem to have existed most likely without money. And I just make that point because I believe that we're still evolving, and that because of that, you get two sides of this coin, where you'll have one person say money is the root of all evil. Now, that's certainly not the case. Money is not the root of all evil. Evil is evil. But people do a lot of evil things for money because of the power of money, the power that money can bring. And that is an important topic to discuss. But when we talk about the civilized world, I don't think we're living in the most civilized time. Because I believe that if we were living at that money wouldn't even be necessary. So if we go to our civilized time, where we would consider the most, or more recent, right? We look at the Greeks, and we look at the Romans. And while considered civilized, these, we'll call them empires, had all sorts of uncivilized things going on within them. All sorts of slavery and horrible human conditions that were allowed to thrive. Lots and lots of wars. Lots and lots of fighting. And again, if we were at our most civilized self, maybe we'd stop fighting amongst each other. But this is where we are. So if we look back into what we know of our civilized world, and where we've had governments and people in charge of other people, this is our recent history. These are the great empires. Now, the Chinese dynasty has been around for a long time. We had the Ottoman empires, and which is essentially Turkey. But all of those are context for the founding fathers. Not so much so, gobeki Tepi or the pyramids. Although the founding fathers would have been aware of the pyramids, those were all attributed to Egyptian culture, 3,000 years ago. Now, I don't think those were built 3,000 years ago, because just like I don't think that Machu Picchu was built that soon. Because how did we lose that technology if it's that recent? Why were they able to move massive rocks back then without mechanization? And we can't do that today. To me, that's like we're going to forget how to build cars. And in 100 years, we won't have any more cars because everyone will have forgot how to build them. Or in 200 years. Right? We just forget how we made things. I don't believe that. But this is all context for the founding fathers. So they would have studied Roman history, Greek history, Egyptian history. They would have studied those governments, and especially European history, and how governance there happened. We're talking about feudalism. We're talking a lot about kings. And if we read the stories of the Bible, a lot of them revolve around kings. So these were the systems set up. Now, the Romans had a republic for a while, and then the Caesars took over. because they had the power of the military. And that power of the military gave them complete power. And then they lost that by devaluing their currency. It was supposed to be gold, but all of a sudden it wasn't gold anymore. It was copper plated with gold. And people knew. And the empires fell. And every empire has fallen. Why? The founding fathers asked these questions. They thought about the liberty of man. They thought about how do we create liberty? What type of country are we going to have? A republic for the people, of the people, by the people, and for the people. This is what our Constitution says. How do you keep it that way? How do you limit government such that it doesn't take away the power of the people? So what lessons should we learn from history about our own government and why the founding fathers set stuff up? And where do we go for that? What limits should government have? How do we ensure that the powers are not exceeded? Now, we're told that we were set up with these branches of government. But what happens when these branches of government don't do their job? What happens if political campaign contributions really are illegal, but the Supreme Court supports Citizens United and says that they're not? So the Supreme Court's job is to decide these things are unconstitutional. But what happens when they don't? What happens when the Supreme Court doesn't do its job? Look at where we are now. We have the oldest president ever. We have very old people running Congress. And as far as I'm concerned, they should all go. On both sides of the aisle. Nancy Pelosi needs to go just as much as Mitch McConnell needs to go. Chuck Schumer can go too. And there's plenty of old people in there that need to go. But are we going to have term limits? Not from the politicians themselves. This is the power they crave and they seek. But these were all questions the founding fathers would have put their energy and efforts into. They had this grand opportunity to create a country where none existed before, where people could have liberty, the right to free speech, so that their government cannot arrest them for speaking out against it. It's fascinating. I'm intrigued by all of this. And when I say, how do you get to a history of finance and understanding money in the United States? Well, you have to look at the beginning of the whole entire thing and how it was set up. So how do we do that? Well, we have the Constitution of the United States. Most people couldn't tell you much of what it says in here except for that first little section of We the People. Most people can get a preamble done. Then when it comes to the articles and the importance of these and preserving principles and guarding virtue and freedom, well, everyone gets a little bit lost. Okay? Well, then, what do we do after that to go, well, how do we understand what the founding fathers wanted? Well, they left us some guides. They left us the Federalist Papers to tell us about why we should be one nation, about why we shouldn't engage in certain types of government, about why they believed that certain things need to be set up certain ways so that people weren't given too much power. The Constitution and the Federalist Papers lead the foundation for us understanding why and how the founding fathers set up our country. And that gives us a starting point so we can look at what's gone wrong along the way, such that we might be able to fix it as the fourth turning comes and we have to make these tough decisions about what kind of country we're really going to be. So we have the Constitution, which is really the what and the how, right? It lists the branches of government and what their powers will be, and the rules by which the citizens can hold them to account. And then we have the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers are the why. The why the government of, why are we a republic? Why weren't 13 colonies turned into 13 countries like Europe was? Why not? They explain it to us. Why was the federal government given the right to coin money and not the states? Why was the government limited to size? Why did the founding fathers limit the ability of taxation? Why in the Constitution do they call out what money is? Why? Because they studied history. So now for us to understand how we got to where we are and maybe what we should do in the future, we need to study some of this history. We need to study the Constitution of the United States. It is not an outdated document that makes no sense and doesn't purport to 21st century requirements. It's not true. Read it. And so that's what this series is going to be about. It's going to be about the history of how we got here, what we can learn along the way, how things got to be where they are, what other powers the government gave itself that may be unconstitutional. And just because the Supreme Court hasn't declared them so doesn't mean it's so. Again, of the people, by the people, and for the people. So if we, the people, decide that that's not the right thing, then we can do something about it. And we're going to have to, because this country is so divided, and for good reason. As much as they would like the Federal Reserve to be in charge of creating jobs, as much as they would like now the Federal Reserve to be in charge of creating equality, the truth is, it's just done the exact opposite. They continue to create mass amounts of inequality. That's just what they do. And these things are not fair for the people. We continue to have less liberty. We continue to have a less free market. Instead, capitalism is blamed when we don't have capitalism anymore. We have government control over most everything. In 2008, we had banks that are too big to fail. This is the easiest and best example that I can give you. The banks are too big to fail. What would the Constitution, what do you think the founding fathers would think about banks too big to fail? Maybe they're just too big. So what did our government do with our banks that are too big to fail after bailing them out? And let them get even bigger. And then it kept allowing them to make political contributions. What could go wrong? We have a lot of problems in this country that we're going to have to fix. The reckoning is coming. My fear is that Americans don't understand where we've come from, that they don't understand our history, and that the manipulation of information, and that's the reason that I went back through some of the answers of how far back in history do we go? How far back does history really go? We have skulls 3 to 4 million years old. We've got structures around the world that show that humans have had technology that we've lost. To put rocks together in such a way that they withstand earthquakes and can be formed and fit perfectly on all sizes and last thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. We're not making those things today. We're not making houses that are going to last 10,000 years. We're not making anything that's going to last 10,000 years. So we've lost some of that, but we've been told otherwise. Our government's got more power than ever, and they're not using it of the people, by the people, and for the people. And therefore, things are going to have to change. The promises made to the baby boomer generation cannot be met. And that's going to create massive conflict in this country. The fourth turning tells us that those conflicts often end in wars. Not necessarily locally, although it could be a civil war in this country, but we could go to war with other countries. This is what's happened in prior fourth turnings. But what is the job of government is the question that we're fundamentally going to have to ask. And if we don't understand why, if we don't understand why the Constitution was written the way that it was, and if we don't understand how government is deviated from that, then it's hard to understand what we should do. to have a country where, again, we get liberty and freedom, because I value those things. A free market, to me, is very valuable to the citizens. It allows the citizens to decide what they want to buy and how much they're willing to pay for it, instead of government deciding where resources will be allocated and who will get what. The government creates the winners and losers in society instead of people being free to do those things on their own. And I think many people came to America specifically for these freedoms. And these freedoms are being reduced all of the time by our current government. So we're going to change it. So we have a couple of different paths we could roll down. But right now the answer seems to be either we go back to a path of limited government, as purported in the Constitution by the Founding Fathers, or we go to a system where government's completely in charge. And then we study history for that system where the government's completely in charge and it doesn't become a state run by one person, where power is consolidated and taken over. And we see if we can find one in history. And maybe that will be our guide to how we move forward. So this is the series that I'm excited to do. I'm not saying it's going to be perfect. I'm sure some of the things that I come up with, but I'm trying to raise the questions. I'm trying to raise the question of what should we do and why, so that we can have a discussion and a debate around it going forward on what and how our government should act and what it should be responsible for, and then what rights are we citizens going to have, because we're losing our rights daily, whether they're being taken away by social media companies, whether we've lost the press and the ability to trust what we read in the paper, whether it's our government spying on us through whether it's the Patriot Act, which is anything but, or recent accounts of the government using our GPS data to track us. That's completely illegal. We look at China and its communist state, where they're now using a social score and recording every movement of their citizens with facial recognition to, in their minds, keep the peace, but it's really to keep the power for the few. So we will answer that fundamental question of, is it of the people, by the people, and for the people? Or is it going to be something much different? And I hope you take this journey with me, and I hope it's educational, and I think we will get to some very interesting information as we go through this on what the Constitution says, what the Federalist Papers say, and how we've manipulated our financial system since then, and what happened when we didn't manipulate it, and what's happened since. So I hope you'll join me on this discovery of several episodes. This is the first and many to come, but obviously you can see based on the information in here, these will take some time to put together. So we will get this done this year and be able to sit and have a discussion long-term about which way we want this country to go. So thanks for listening. Please share with your friends and family, and we'll catch you next time.